So I'm looking here at the initial scene um, that comes from the Action RPG setup, and we're going to go ahead and start tearing things apart so that we can reuse it. So to begin with, I'm going to go take a look at the world settings so I can find the game mode easily. I'll open up the game mode, and this is where we can find the game start. So we have this default cutscene right here, and what we want to do is not play that because we don't really want to go there, and instead we want to do start game. And the start game event down here is where we actually get all this set up, right? So we're going to take out the timer for now, at least, and the enemy spawn, because we don't want to spawn this kind of enemy. We want to look at this in the new fashion. So I'm going to compile that and then test it out over here by clicking play. And so I know that the game works immediately and that there's no enemies. So everything is as expected there. Okay, so before we get too far in, let's take a look at the nav mesh and make sure that we understand what it's doing. So we see this outline here, this orange outline specifies the boundaries. And if I press the P key in this view, then I see where it has computed a nav mesh. And if I were to resize this by scaling it in either direction, the Y and the Z here, I see that the green boundary moves along with that. So this tells me where characters can walk, including my player character in some cases, and especially the AI that we're going to use. Now we're going to set up our folder where we'll put all of the modifications we're going to do. So I'm going to create a new folder called Assignment 3, and I will start creating things in here. So I'm going to start by creating a new blueprint class, which is based on the Goblin, NPC Goblin. And I'm going to call it Smart Goblin. Okay. So we have just the simple construction script, and we have parent and event play. And now we've got our Goblin. Okay, so given our folder that has all of our, or is going to be the container for all this, let's set up a few AI components. So we'll start by creating a behavior tree. We'll call this Goblin Behavior. We will set up a blackboard, and this blackboard is going to keep track of all of the variables that we care about. So Goblin Blackboard, this can be the way we communicate from our controller in, and then we're going to create a blueprint class based on AI controller, and we're going to call this class our Goblin Controller. Then what we'll do is down here, the very bottom of the Goblin Controller class itself, is we will choose Goblin Controller. So this is where we are going to possess our AI, and so whether we place it in the world or we spawn it, we want to be able to possess it with our Goblin Controller. And notice that it's not being controlled by a human, so this is the difference between the two. We have an AI controller controlling this versus a human controlling it. So underneath our AI over here, I'm going to create a new folder called Control Points. And I'm going to create this new, see, I need to look at all classes, and I want this target point. I'm going to create one of these out here somewhere. I'm hitting the F key to zoom in on it. And so I'm going to have target point 1. I'm going to rename this to Control Points. So I'm going to rename it to Control Point 1. So I'm going to have a 2. I'm also going to add a component to it. So I'm going to add a sphere collider to it. The sphere collider at 30 centimeters is probably, or 32 centimeters is probably just fine. And then I will move this guy. Actually, I'll go ahead and duplicate him real quick. So now we've got a Control Point 2. Scroll up here. Close all of these so it's easy to do the drag and drop. I'm going to drag these guys up into my patrol points folder so that I have them located. And then patrol point 2, I'm going to make sure to move it elsewhere, right, so that we can have some amount of movement happen when this guy's going. So let me move over here, and I'll set up a patrol point probably right there, the second one. We'll just have to move back and forth between these two spaces. Okay, so we're going to set up the communication now. So we need to, in our Blackboard, create a new kind of variable called patrol point. Oops. We'll make it an object. This is going to be the patrol point that we're going to move to. This is a type actor. Now back in our Smart Goblin, I'm going to need to open up the full blueprint editor so that I get all of this, and I'm going to attach a new script. And this initialization is going to get the Blackboard. So let's see. I'm going to Alright, so we'll get the Blackboard. Go ahead and unpin some of these comments. Move around a little bit. We're going to set value as object, and we're going to make this be current patrol point. So in order to do that, I'm going to need a current patrol point variable. And this one is going to be actor. We'll go ahead while we're at it, and we'll set up its patrol point 1 and 2. And we're going to set all of these guys. Actually, we don't need current patrol point to be global, but we'll set this variable patrol point 1 and patrol point 2. And we can see that if we wanted to, because these are visible, I could set different patrol points for different characters using these things. So I want to get the current patrol point and set that to the object, and I'm going to pull this out and say make literal, and we're going to do it the word patrol point. Remember that these things need to match, so I need this word patrol point here to match this word patrol point here, otherwise it will not work when we actually run. I'm going to have it do this setup first and then call the parent begin play. And the parent's begin play is important because that's where, actually I guess I can't double click that, but that's where some of this other kinds of activity happens, like setting up the weapons and things that the goblin needs to do. Okay, I'm going to set a comment around this. And the next thing we'll do is we'll use the overlap here. I'm going to move these guys out of the way so you can see a little better. And we want, when we overlap, let's set up a branch to start with. We want to know whether or not this actor is equal to our patrol point 1 or 2. So I'll say patrol point 1. If it's patrol point 1, I'm going to have it set current patrol point to patrol point 2. Right, so this is, if I'm currently hitting patrol point 1, then I need to set to patrol point 2. If that's not the case, well, let me make sure actually this condition ties here. If that's not the case, I'm going to check again. I have a second branch, and this time I'm going to say, is the actor patrol point 2? If the actor is patrol point 2, that's this condition, and if that's true, then I'm going to set current patrol point to patrol point 1. I could put an error case on this false. It's usually a good idea to double check that you're not hitting something else, but of course we could overlap with a large number of things which will neither of them be patrol point 1 or 2, and so rather than have all of those spit out errors in this case, we'll just go ahead and leave that empty. We'll set out a comment. say that as we move between these, we are moving our patrol points. Let's get the tick way down here so it's out of our way. One thing I forgot to mention is that after we've set up the patrol point here, we're just going to borrow the same set value over here for both of these to make sure that our patrol point gets set again. So again, this is going to set up the blackboard value and set the patrol point there. Now we've done the work of setting up the smart goblin to be controlled by the controller. We need to now make the association between the goblin controller itself and the blackboard. And so on that, we're going to say, when it begins play, we're going to say run this behavior tree. Sorry, I said blackboard, I meant behavior tree. And the BT asset that we're going to use is our goblin behavior, right? Or whatever else we might have called it. And this is going to set up the tie from all the way from here, where our goblin is using or being overwritten because of its pawn. Actually, I can't see that set up over here. Oh, there it is. So goblin controller is controlling the pawn, is controlling smart goblin, and then goblin behavior is tied in over here. Okay, now finally we can move into the behavior tree itself. First we need to make sure that our blackboard is set to goblin blackboard so that we get our behavior tree. And then, actually let's see, let's just use this blackboard asset. Yeah. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple sequence to start with to just move between our patrol points. So previously I've shown, actually we'll just go ahead and put the selector in so that we've got it, even though the second half of the selector is not going to run because the first half will never fail. Just in case it does, we'll set up a sequence, and remember a sequence runs all of its tasks. The selector runs only the first task that succeeds. That's all of them run. And the sequence runs until one of the tasks fails. In this case, we're going to do move to, and this will be patrol point. So you can see it automatically selected patrol point because it's trying to find some blackboard key, and we only really have one. And so it's going to look for the patrol key or patrol point. And recall that this will be set to whatever current patrol point is over here because of all of the work that we did here to set up the current patrol point. And then if for some reason this move to does actually fail, we will idle. Oops. We'll wait, and we'll just have him wait for, say, 3 seconds. So we'll rename this as our idle sequence. We'll rename this as our patrol sequence. Okay, so again, for the most part, we're going to succeed in patrol. If by some chance we're unable to move, then we will fail. So the last step here is that we need to set up our goblin character. Let's go ahead and put him somewhere in the scene. I'll put him far enough away from one of these two. So I've got one of my patrol points over here and the other one over here. Okay, so I'm going to set patrol point 1 here and patrol point 2 here. One last note here, in order to set up the initial patrol point variable, we'll just go ahead and make this a publicly visible variable on the character. That way, when we compile it, we can see it over here, and we'll set up his first patrol point as patrol point 2, just so we can see him moving further away. Now that we have that initial setup with our patrol points and our initialization of those patrol points and our goblin behavior, press play and we see the goblin moving. If we go and take a look at our behavior, we see he's moving down this side of the path. Of course, even though he's moving back and forth across the path, he really just stays right here and moves between those two. You see that when he runs in, he hits one of those and sets up the target. So we'll look at that again. Runs over here. So if he hits it, we see that again he's connecting one of these and sets the other patrol point. Okay, so now we have the patrol point behavior. We'll go ahead and set up the visual. Our next step here is to create the ability for the character to see, and so on our controller here, we will add pawn sensing, and this gives us the new event on see pawn, and later we will also use on hear noise. So I'll go ahead and click the add there so that we see the pawn. We want player character to let us know that it's actually the character that we're targeting. And then with that we will set up a new blackboard. So I'll go ahead and get the blackboard, so I'll get a reference to self, get blackboard, and in this case I'm going to set target value. The object will be the player object, and the key name will be player target. And so in order to make sure that that works, I'm going to go quickly over to the goblin tree and create a new key. Again, an object. That object's key type needs to be actor. And it will be player target. So now given that, I know that in my controller, and it's maybe a choice, we could also put this pawn onto the smart goblin, and we may have actually done that in class as a difference. It doesn't matter because both of these are kind of tied to the same location. And now we will add in a new sequence into our behavior tree. We're going to create a decorator which is going to look for a blackboard object. As we mentioned in class, a blackboard object for isSet is often very common. There's a way to do this, and we'll rename this as can see player. So if our player target is set and we can see the player, what we're going to do is move to, and rather than a patrol point, we're going to move to our character target. One important note I almost forgot to mention, again, is that when we have these conditions, we can tell them to abort, and we will abort lower priority. And what we see here is that these are marked in blue to say these are the sequences that we will abort if suddenly this becomes true, right? So if this is false, the selector is going to move on with its life. But if this suddenly becomes true, then we're going to pop back and run the sequence instead. Okay, and that's what this abort lower priority means, that these guys are lower priority because they're to the right, and that we will abort them if this suddenly becomes true. So to test this out, we will play our normal, and this time we will come over and get to where we can actually see the character. So we see that he's changed, he moves over to us, and as soon as he reaches us, in this case right here, he can follow us forever. Yeah, but we know that it at least worked. Okay, so let's add in some better behaviors, some more advanced behaviors here, and a placeholder for our attack. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have it wait for half a second. So this is going to look a little bit like a reaction time. The goblin is going to, oops, not 0.05, 0.5 seconds. He's going to wait for that long, and then he's going to start moving toward the player. When he reaches the player, we'll have him wait again, and this is just going to be a placeholder for our attack, and we're going to use that. We'll do a 2-second wait there, and then we're going to create a new task based on the blueprint base, and quickly we'll come over to our setting here, and we'll call this AT-task reset value, and over here we're going to create new variable key. It's going to be blackboard key, and we will create another new variable value. It'll be public here, and the value is also going to be public. And this one will be an actor. We'll receive execute. We are going to set blackboard use object. Our key will be key that we provide up here. the value will be the value that we're passing in. Again, these are global variables. These will be available on our task. And then we need to finish execute. We'll finish execute with success here. And given this, we now have a new task we can put in here called reset value. The key will be our player target. We're going to tell it to reset the player target, and we're going to set it to none. Before we get too far, I'm going to set the move distance, acceptable radius, to closer to 50 centimeters so it doesn't get quite so close. But let's test that out. So we'll save it, we'll press play. Here. And we'll notice that he freezes momentarily and then comes over, so it's a little bit like a reacting. Moves in, he gets to about a half a meter away. He does not attack. We will come back over here, and instead of this wait task, we're going to go and look at what the original enemy actor did. And so we'll take a look at the blueprints over here for the NPC or the AI. So we see this BT and NPC class has the behavior tree for this. So there's a ranged attack here, which we could use if we had a ranged player, and here's a close enough to attack. Again, we're looking to see if we're at least closer than 400. And what we want to do is use this BT attack melee, which is a task that's already been set up. And so we'll just come over here, and we will use the attack melee here. Now it has this is attacking. We actually don't need it, but we'll put it in there just so that we have something to use that doesn't look weird as a Boolean. But if we actually look into this task, we see that although the is attacking is here, if we choose to find references, we notice that there's no actual references to that variable, so it's not being used in here. Okay, so to test this out, then we just want to make sure that once our character, our enemy sees us, reacts, and comes over, he will hit us. He'll then immediately forget about us and go back to his patrol route, which is fine. But this is a good test, so we could do a number of things. We could change that behavior up. This is where we'll go now, just to make it reasonable. So now we'll start setting things up for the case where we actually hear sounds. So we will go back over to our goblin behavior. We'll create two new keys. One will be a vector, which is location of sound, and the other will be a Boolean, which has heard sound. And so we've got these two set up, and then we'll come back over to our behavior tree. And what we're going to do is grab all of these tasks and move them far to the left here. We'll go ahead and move these other guys far to the right so we've got enough room to work. And we'll bring in a new sequence. This one's going to be our investigate sound. So we'll go ahead and name this one while I'm over here. Distinguish these two. And then again, we'll set up a decorator, Blackboard decorator. I'm going to look for whether or not has heard sound is set, and we'll call this heard sound. Now given that, we're going to, we could do a reaction, but we'll go ahead and just move this sound in this case. Of course, it's up to your preference. We'll move to the location of sound. We will wait some amount of time. We'll go ahead and wait for 5 seconds plus or minus 3. So let's make that 3 plus or minus 2. So we wait at least 1 second and maybe up to 5 seconds. And then finally we need to set up another reset task, except this time we need to do a reset bool value. So we'll go ahead and do blueprint base and come back over to our where these things are getting set. We'll call this one BT task reset Boolean. And it's going to be a little different, very similar to our reset task that we saw over here. Let me bring up our behavior. So our reset value here, we've got on receive execute, we set value, and of course value in this case is null. Over here, we will go ahead and create the same thing. We'll have a key. our Blackboard key selector, and we'll do a value. In this case, we kind of know the value is going to be null, but we may want to say reset to true for some reason. So we'll again do value bool, and then receive execute. Set value as bool this time. Key is our key. Value is our value. And then we will finish execute as before. The new thing we're going to do is that we will also receive abort. And in this case, we still want to actually set the value again. So we want to set the value because we want to make sure that we forget to ignore sounds. And the reason that we would abort in this case is that we are getting a call from higher value, and in our case here the higher value is whether or not we've seen the player. So if we see the player, we're also going to do this abort task, and we will finish abort. So the normal case is that we finish all the way through, so we go through our behavior tree here, we go investigate the sound, we finish investigating the sound, our sequence runs, and now we run our execute and reset our value and ignore the sound that we heard. In the case where we see the player, we also want to ignore the sound because now we see the player, so we don't really care about investigating the sound anymore. So what we can see is over here, when we do this BT task reset boolean, we will reset has heard sound, and we'll give it a value false, right? We're going to call this reset has heard sound. Got a little bit easier one. In fact, we can rename this one reset player target. So we know that we don't want to see the player target anymore. And so what happens is, regardless of, once we get in here, we know we've got the has heard sound set. If we get aborted by this, then we want to reset the sound either case, right? So it's going to make sure that this happens whether or not it goes through. Now the last thing we need to do is, again, reset lower priority, and we'll notice that our lower priority here is all of these guys, right? But our lower priority here, well, technically I suppose the self is our lower priority, but everybody to our right should be considered our lower priority. Finally, in order to hear the sound, we actually need to set up the has heard sound event, right? So in our pawn sensing, we already have the C pawn over here. Now what we want to do is capture the heard noise, right? And so we are, let's first take a look again at the pawn sensing. So we've got both a hearing threshold and a line of sight hearing threshold. And so this is, if we're behind something, we'll use this hearing threshold, right? So behind the rocks, for instance, will actually be heard. And then this line of sight threshold is when there's a clear line of sight, so a clear view, there's nothing blocking us, right? So line of sight is a little bit strange, but we'll go ahead and set this a little higher to 2000 so that we can hear things like through the rocks and whatnot in our particular environment. We want to play around with this a little bit. This tends to be a pretty safe bet. And having that, essentially, we get this very easy case of we just need to both set the vector and set the value. So let's do this. Let's get a reference to self again. We'll get our blackboard. And we are going to set value as vector this time. And this vector is going to be our location here. And so the key name, and double check this to make sure I've got the right one. So I'm going to come back over to our key. I'm going to copy this text from location of sound and then paste that text in here. So the location of sound is being set there. And then the next one is set value as bool. In this case, we know it's going to be true. We know we just want to do that. We want to make sure it's the same blackboard. And this time, it's going to be the other value we've got over here, which is has heard sound. So I'll go ahead and copy this one and paste it in so that I know that they match. Now we get to edit our player character. So we'll come over to the standard blueprints. We'll come over to BP player character here. And we're going to look for a place to generate a sound. So first thing we need to do is pawn noise emitter. We're going to add this component, and it's going to allow us to emit noises. And then within our rolling activity, so at the tail end of this rolling activity, whenever we do this, we're going to also make noise, right? So if wherever we decide to roll, we could also attach this to our attack sequence somewhere in here, or wherever that attack sequence happens, somewhere deep in this tree. But let's just do the rolling. It's an easy one to test. And so what we'll do is make noise, and we'll use the make noise emitter. Our noise maker is self. So we'll get reference self. The loudness, we could potentially play around with that, but we'll go ahead and just call it 1. And then the last one we'll do is actor location. And notice that this will also just use self. We could pass in the same reference to self here. But this will be, so we're going to set the loudness to 1, varies between 0 and 1. We could make it quieter if we felt like, to make some noises larger, some noises smaller. In this case, we always want the loudest, just especially when we're testing. And the noise location is going to be where our actor was when this happened, right? So the current action as soon as we start doing our roll activity. Because this one's a little more complicated this time, I'm going to go ahead and put a breakpoint here. So I'm going to add a breakpoint into our behavior tree. Remember that we can add breakpoints almost anywhere in this thing. And I want to make sure that when I hear a sound that I trigger. So we notice that he's not hearing the sound over here. We're really too far away. But I'm behind the rocks, and so I should be able to use the 20 meters. So I can right click here, and now we notice that it's going to do this. So we'll go ahead and resume. Back over to review. See me start to run. So now, if you see me, I'm going to switch over to do this thing, attack. Back to this case. In this case, it's come back to there are 4 Okay, lastly, let's change our enemy from one guy that's out there to enemies that get spawned. So let's go ahead and delete this character. And we will, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate one of these patrol points and call it a spawn point instead. So essentially the same kind of thing, but now it's a spawn point. We will move it to a slightly different location. Let's move it to where we were currently spawning our character anyway. So make sure that that's on our nav mesh. And then we're going to do all of our edits here from the level blueprint. So the level blueprint is a little bit like the global game mode blueprint, but the game mode is for the entire game, and the level is for just the level, right? So part of what's happening here is it's loading in all of this stuff that is going on. We'll go ahead and start spawning after this piece, but after the sound goes in and the fade out and so on. We'll splice in here. So let's do a set timer. We'll do it by function name. So we'll create a new function to do this, and then create a variable called spawn time. Make it a float. And then our time will be here. So go ahead and set that public, but just for this case, we'll go ahead and every 10 seconds, by default, we'll do this. Now the function name, we'll go ahead and say spawn, and we'll need to create that. So let's create, a spawn function. And what we're going to do with this spawn function is create instances of our character. Right? So we are, we're going to need this spawn point here too. that to the actor. All right, we'll come back to set that later. Okay, so we will let's actually go ahead and do that. So we'll pull over this spawn AI from class. And the pawn class is going to be Goblin, Smart Goblin. Our behavior tree we're going to use is our Goblin behavior. And yeah, that should be it. Okay, now from our spawn point, we'll go ahead and bring in the spawn point here. We will location. This gives us the vector, and then we're going to choose a random point within this in order to actually get a different rotation. So we'll go ahead and let them always spawn right there. Actually, we'll actually fix that. Let's see. So I'll do get random point, random reachable point and radius. We'll use that as our return value. And we'll say anywhere within, say, 5 meters of that would be okay. And we're also going to set up a rotation here. So we'll just do random float. Set this to, let's do axis angle here. So the axis is going to be around the z-axis, and that'll be our rotator here. Okay, a couple things to fix up on our level blueprint before we get too much further. Let's go ahead and actually set the reachable point and radius to 30, just so it's very close to our spawn point. We will set our spawn point default to the spawn point over here, just to be safe. And let's actually set our spawn time to about 5 seconds. We can tune this later if we want to, but this is a good case for testing. So because our character does not have or needs to know about patrol points currently, we're going to just change that patrol to just a random wander instead, which will simplify it. So we're going to go ahead and delete these nodes that are not really being hit anymore at all. We'll change our patrol point to call a wander point. In fact, actually, I'm just going to go ahead and delete the patrol point entirely and create a new, we'll do it with vectors. And back over here, we'll go ahead and rather than move to there, we will move to our wander point. And what we'll do is set up a new task called, actually, create it first. So one more time, we'll create this blueprint base. We'll go ahead and rename it. Come over to our action here. Say BT task, new wander. And then our new wander, when we receive execute, we will I guess first get a key. Let's set up the wander key over here. This will be our Blackboard key. We'll want to set the Blackboard key as vector some point here, and that will be our wander key. And so what we're going to need to do is get a hold of the actor, get to controller, put this here, connect this here, and our controller, we need to get the pawn. We'll get the controlled pawn there. From the pawn, we will get the location, and then from there, whenever we're getting this new point, we will choose a new point. Get a new point in radius. Do 10 meters away from our current point. The origin will be where we currently are, and then this will be our new target. And so what we're doing is setting up the wander key. Every time we're going to hit the new wander, we will set up a new wander location. So we're going to move to a point, and then we're going to do new wander. And that will create a new task for us. Actually, I want to make sure that that key is global. Finally, before we exit here, we want to make sure that we actually finish our execute with success, otherwise our behavior tree will never end. Public. And the key that we're going to set is the wander point. So set this up, put this to the left. So the first thing we want to do is find our wander point. We're going to start wandering, move to our wander point, and then we'll go ahead and wait here for a little bit. We'll call it 3 seconds, plus or minus 1, a little bit like the investigating. And of course, we'll change the name up here to wander. Now we're finally ready to see it all together, so we will press play. Right now we have it set to every 5 seconds. Our character will pop up. It's going to start wandering. It'll probably do whatever it can. It's of course now smart about investigating sounds. It still knows how to see us, hit us. In this case, when it decides to stop hitting us, it goes back to wandering. When it stops for 2 seconds, we go back to wandering. Looks like there's one other thing that we forgot to do, and that is to make sure that our spawn behavior in our top level is looping. So we'll go back to our stream over here. We'll set that to looping, compile it, and let's test it one more time just to see. So now we should see every 5 seconds the characters pop in. Of course, this gets pretty challenging pretty quickly. There's some difference with the normal gameplay. We no longer have waves. We do have our die the wave. But the army gets filled up pretty quick. So this gets challenging pretty fast. And all of them are smart enough to be able to investigate sounds and to see us. So it's a little bit of a different case. Maybe we can try to